in the frozen plains of Manchuria, in what is now northeastern China, stood a facility that would become the site of some of the most horrific atrocities in human history. This is the story of Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Behind the facade of epidemic prevention, thousands of innocent people were subjected to barbaric experiments that defy comprehension. This is a story of unimaginable cruelty, scientific ethics abandoned and justice delayed. The mastermind behind Unit 731 was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless microbiologist and army medical officer. Born in 1892 to a wealthy family, Ishii graduated from Kyoto Imperial University and quickly rose through the military medical ranks. In the 1920s, while studying abroad, he became fascinated with biological warfare, particularly after the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned such weapons. His twisted logic was simple. If nations felt compelled to ban biological weapons, they must be extremely effective. Ishii was charismatic and politically savvy. He convinced Japan's military leadership that biological warfare could give them a decisive advantage. By 1932, he had established a secret research program, initially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The name was deliberately innocuous, a perfect cover for the nightmare that would unfold. In 1936, construction began on a massive complex near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The facility covered 6 square kilometers and included laboratories, barracks, crematoria, and prison cells. At its peak, Unit 731 employed over 3,000 people, including doctors, scientists, technicians, and military personnel. The complex was divided into sections. Some buildings housed laboratories where experiments were conducted. Others contained cells where prisoners were kept, prisoners who would never leave alive. The Japanese referred to these victims with a chilling euphemism, maruta, meaning logs of wood. This dehumanizing language made it easier for perpetrators to justify their actions. Who were the victims of Unit 731? The vast majority were Chinese civilians, men, women, children, and infants. They included political prisoners, suspected resistance fighters, and often people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Soviet prisoners of war, Mongolians, Koreans, and other nationalities were also subjected to these experiments. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 people died in Unit 731's facilities, though the true number may be as high as 10,000 or more when including field tests and biological warfare attacks. These weren't soldiers on a battlefield, they were innocent civilians, captured and condemned to deaths of unimaginable suffering, all in the name of scientific research. Among the most brutal experiments were those involving frostbite. Japanese forces needed to understand how to treat frostbite as they fought in harsh winter conditions. But rather than conducting ethical research, Unit 731 scientists deliberately froze prisoners' limbs to study the effects. Victims would be taken outside in freezing temperatures, sometimes drenched in water, and left until their limbs froze solid. Researchers would then test various methods of thawing, sometimes using hot water, sometimes gradual warming. They would strike frozen limbs with sticks to hear the sound, documenting the results. Many victims had their limbs amputated without anesthesia, so researchers could study gangrene and infection. The experiments were repeated on the same individuals until they died or were executed. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Unit 731 was the practice of vivisection surgical operations performed on living human beings without anesthesia. The rationale was that anesthesia would affect the results, making observations less accurate. In reality, this was torture masquerading as science. Prisoners were dissected alive so researchers could observe organs functioning in real time. They studied the effects of disease, poison, and weapons on living bodies. Organs were removed while victims remained conscious. Some experiments involved removing organs and reattaching them to different parts of the body, or exchanging body parts between victims. The screams could be heard throughout the facility. Unit 731 also conducted extreme pressure experiments. Victims were placed in high-pressure chambers to see how much pressure the human body could withstand before organs ruptured. In other experiments, researchers would create vacuum conditions to observe what happened when pressure was suddenly released. Former Unit 731 member Yoshio Shinozuka later testified that he witnessed prisoners' eyeballs popping out of their sockets due to extreme pressure changes. Internal organs would rupture, and victims would hemorrhage from every orifice. These weren't military experiments to develop protective equipment. They were simply documentation of human suffering with no practical application. The primary mission of Unit 731 was biological warfare research, and this meant deliberately infecting victims with deadly diseases. Prisoners were injected with plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other pathogens. Researchers would then document the progression of disease without providing treatment. Some victims were infected multiple times with different diseases to observe interactions. Others were infected and then subjected to additional stresses, starvation, extreme temperatures, or physical trauma to see how these factors affected disease progression. The goal was to create the most effective biological weapons and understand how they could be deployed against enemy populations. Unit 731 also tested conventional weapons on living human subjects. Prisoners were tied to stakes at various distances, while grenades, bombs, and flamethrowers were tested on them. The purpose was to determine optimal blast radius, shrapnel patterns, and burn effects. Some victims were buried to different depths to test how well they were protected from explosions. Others were positioned at high angles to determine how body position affected injury patterns. These experiments had a veneer of military utility, but they crossed every ethical line imaginable. The data collected was written in cold clinical language that divorced the researchers from the human cost of their work. Among the most disturbing aspects of Unit 731's work were experiments involving pregnant women and families. Female prisoners were raped, sometimes by infected men, to study disease transmission. Pregnant women were subjected to vivisection to observe fetal development. Infants and children were not spared. They were infected with diseases, subjected to the same pressure and frostbite experiments as adults, and used in studies on malnutrition and growth. Some experiments involved deliberately separating mothers and children to observe psychological effects. The cruelty extended across generations, with entire families subjected to coordinated experiments. Unit 731's work wasn't confined to the laboratory. Between 1940 and 1942, the Japanese military conducted biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities. Plague-infected fleas were bred by the millions and dropped over population centers using specially designed bombs. In the city of Ningbo, a biological attack in 1940 killed an estimated 500 people. In Changde in 1941, plague killed approximately 7,000. These attacks caused epidemics that persisted for years, killing far more people than the initial deployment. Cholera was also weaponized and released into water supplies, causing massive civilian casualties. These weren't attacks on military targets. They were acts of biological terrorism against civilian populations. The industrial scale of Unit 731's operations was staggering. The facility included factories for mass-producing biological agents. They could produce up to 300 kilograms of plague bacteria per month. There were breeding facilities for rats and fleas, cultivation chambers for bacteria, and storage facilities for weapons. Beyond Unit 731, there were satellite facilities. Unit 100 focused on animal diseases that could destroy enemy agriculture. Unit 516 tested chemical weapons. I-1644 conducted similar experiments on Chinese soil. Together, these units formed a vast network of biological and chemical warfare research that employed thousands and victimized tens of thousands. For the perpetrators, Unit 731 was simply their job. Researchers lived in comfortable quarters within the compound. They had access to entertainment, good food, and amenities. Some brought their families to live nearby. They held parties, celebrated holidays, and maintained a facade of normalcy. Former members later testified about the psychological mechanisms that allowed them to commit atrocities. New recruits were gradually exposed to more disturbing work. Dehumanizing language made it easier to view victims as experimental subjects rather than people. Group psychology created pressure to conform, and the military structure meant following orders without question. Some doctors convinced themselves they were serving a greater good protecting Japanese soldiers and civilians through their research. As the war turned against Japan in 1945, Unit 731's leaders began planning their escape when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945. Soviet forces advanced rapidly toward Harbin. Ishii ordered the destruction of evidence. In the final days, remaining prisoners were executed, some by poison, others by shooting. Buildings were rigged with explosives and destroyed. Documents were burned. Plague-infected rats were released. Some accounts suggest this caused a plague epidemic in Harbin afterward. The facility's staff were evacuated back to Japan. By the time Soviet forces arrived, they found ruins and scattered evidence, but most perpetrators had escaped. When Japan surrendered, Allied forces began investigating war crimes. The Soviet Union captured some Unit 731 personnel and held trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. However, the American occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur made a different choice. The United States granted immunity to Unit 731's leaders in exchange for their research data. The Cold War was beginning, and American military officials wanted access to biological warfare research that had been conducted on human subjects, research that would have been impossible to replicate ethically. Ishii and his top scientists provided their data and were never prosecuted. This devil's bargain meant that justice was sacrificed for military advantage. Protected by American immunity deals, many Unit 731 perpetrators went on to successful careers in post-war Japan. Shiro Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo working as a consultant. He died of throat cancer in 1959, never having faced justice. Other doctors became university professors, heads of medical organizations, and pharmaceutical company executives. Some Unit 731 veterans founded the Japan Blood Bank, which later became the Green Cross Corporation, a major pharmaceutical company. The normalization of these war criminals sent a chilling message about accountability and justice. only a handful of lower-ranking members were ever prosecuted, mostly by the Soviet Union. The architects of the atrocities lived comfortable lives, protected by geopolitics and military secrecy. For decades, Unit 731 remained largely unknown. The American cover-up kept documents classified. The Japanese government remained silent. Victims and their families had no platform to demand justice, but gradually the truth began to emerge. In the 1980s and 1990s, investigative journalists in Japan began uncovering the story. Former Unit 731 members, now elderly, began giving testimony, some expressing remorse, others remaining defiant. Chinese survivors and family members shared their experiences. Researchers excavated the Harbin site, discovering human remains and artifacts that corroborated testimony. The discovery of thousands of pages of American documents, declassified decades after the war, revealed the extent of the cover-up. These documents showed that the US military had detailed knowledge of Unit 731's experiments, and deliberately chose to grant immunity in exchange for data. Survivors and their descendants have fought for acknowledgement and compensation. Chinese citizens who were victims of biological warfare attacks filed lawsuits against the Japanese government. These legal battles have been largely unsuccessful. Japanese courts have acknowledged that atrocities occurred but dismissed claims on technicalities or statutes of limitations. The Japanese government's official position has evolved over decades, but many critics argue it remains inadequate. Some textbooks minimize or omit Unit 731 entirely. Government officials have made apologies, but victims as advocates argue these don't go far enough and lack meaningful action. The contrast with Germany's approach to Holocaust remembrance is stark. While Germany has acknowledged its crimes, educated future generations, and provided compensation to victims, Japan's reckoning with Unit 731 and other wartime atrocities remains incomplete. This has created ongoing tensions with China, South Korea, and other affected nations. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Harbin houses a museum dedicated to documenting these atrocities. Opened in 1985 and expanded multiple times, the museum preserves some of the original buildings, displays artifacts recovered from the site, and presents testimony from survivors and perpetrators. Visitors can see the incinerators where bodies were burned, the frostbite laboratory, and the prison cells where victims were held. The museum serves as a memorial to the thousands who died and as an educational resource to ensure these crimes are not forgotten. It receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, though controversy continues over how these dark chapters of history are remembered and taught. The legacy of Unit 731 raises profound questions about medical ethics, scientific responsibility, and justice. How did educated doctors and scientists convince themselves to commit such atrocities? What does it say about human nature that ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil? These questions aren't merely historical. Unit 731 demonstrated how easily ethical boundaries can be crossed when science is divorced from morality. It showed how dehumanization enables atrocity, and it revealed how political considerations can override justice. The case also highlights ongoing debates about whether data obtained through unethical means should ever be used. Some of Unit 731's research did provide genuine medical insights, particularly regarding frostbite treatment. But using this data means benefiting from human suffering, potentially validating the torture that produced it. There's no easy answer, but the question itself is crucial for modern bioethics. The story of Unit 731 is one of humanity at its darkest. It reminds us that science without ethics is dangerous, that dehumanization enables atrocity, and that the quest for justice can be obstructed by political convenience. The victims of Unit 731 deserve to be remembered not as logs of wood or experimental subjects, but as individuals with names, families, and lives that were brutally stolen. Their suffering demands acknowledgement, not silence. As we confront modern ethical questions about medical research, biological weapons, and human rights, the shadow of Unit 731 serves as a warning. It challenges us to ensure that never again means never again, not just for one atrocity, but for the mindset that enables all atrocities. The frozen plains of Manchuria keep their secrets, but the truth, however uncomfortable, must be told. This is how we honor the victims. This is how we prevent history from repeating itself.